Thank you for joining us. We're really pleased to have you. I think we're streaming and we're also we're here in person, and we want to have this as a full conversation. So I think we need some help. I don't know if Christy's here getting a microphone, John. Are we gonna have? Oh, they're right there. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So first, I want to introduce the two of us and give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. We are really two people who love politics and have spent most of our lives thinking or working or doing things in politics. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Wendy Schiller. I'm the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science and the Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. And I teach classes on American politics and gender and public policy. Sitting to my left is Tom Perez, who is a Brown alum and started early in politics. He was a member of the Montgomery County Council. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Justice Department, Secretary of Labor, and Chair of the Democratic National Committee. And he's currently, to our great benefit, a Senior Fellow at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. Have I left anything out?
That is fine.
Okay, all right. So what we thought today is that we consulted together, and we have a series of questions we thought might be great to cover. We want to leave it open to see if there's anything that we forget or you would like to have us cover as well. So I'm not sure what we're doing about the Q&A, if there's any live streaming, but somebody will tell us. Okay, so we'll start. Did you want to start with a little bit of introductory remarks about the 2020 election, or do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I guess the main thing I would say is, if we were having an honest, fact-informed conversation about the 2020 election, we would be having a bipartisan celebration of record turnout in the throes of a pandemic, a global pandemic, and yet we had record turnout. If someone asks the question, who got the most votes ever in American history in an election, the answer is Joe Biden. Who got the second most votes in American history in an election? The answer is Donald Trump. Record turnout. Record turnout helped Democrats win the presidency, no doubt about it. Look at Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan. Record turnout helped Republicans obtain a net gain of 13 seats in the United States House of Representatives. I can tell you, I was talking regularly, because at that point I was chair of the Democratic National Committee. I was talking regularly with Speaker Pelosi. And, I'd often ask the question, what's your sense of the range of possibility here entering Election Day? And I think both of us had a sense that, our range was probably low end +5 for Dems, high end maybe +12. It was never in the realm of possibility that we were going to lose 13 seats. That's exactly what happened. How did that happen? Folks turned out. They voted. Not here to tell you that Republicans cheated. Donald Trump was a turnout machine in certain districts, especially in Texas. There were a few people running there in Texas that I frankly would have taken curtain measurements on, Professor, because I had a really high degree of confidence that they were going to win. We should be celebrating that, and instead look at all of the laws that have been passed in Texas and elsewhere, and we saw the immediate aftermath of some of what Texas is trying to do in this most recent the most recent primaries for the 2022 cycle. It's unfortunate. And I think today's discussion, we need to understand and be fact-based. And again, if we were honest with each other, we would have that bipartisan celebration. We'd ask the question, wow, what did we do right that enabled everybody to get out there, vote, and have their voices heard? And some of us were really happy about some things, and some of us were really unhappy. Changing the rules, as we're seeing across the country, is really democracy at its worst. And that's what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, I think to add, what we want to do is think about the sort of general American public and whether they see difficulty voting or feel difficulty voting. And what we saw in 2020 in terms of the turnout was that people managed to vote, mail-in vote, certainly the pandemic. A lot of states like Colorado, for example, went all-mail ballot for the first time in a sweeping way. The Western states have almost all uniformly adopted some form of mail-in ballot. And they are now, you can vote in person if you want to, but they generally discourage it. So I think there's a lot of changes, and the issue is, does that give people perception that voting is secure and that it's easy to vote, even in the midst of these changes that we're seeing in some states like Georgia and Texas, where they are actively making it harder to vote? Is there a disconnect between what state legislatures are doing on voting in some states and how people perceive the voting process? And is that going to catch up in 2022 by disenfranchising? We've already seen that in Texas, where absentee ballots were discounted, 23,000 of them, in a traditionally Democratic county. The question is, that the impact of these laws will disenfranchise people in 2022, but the vast majority of Americans won't sense it because it's not a presidential election, and they won't feel that they're disenfranchised. So that's the big time lag puzzle that I think we're grappling with, that we want to grapple with. But before we begin that, let's, to that point, and Shelby v. Holder, which is a relatively famous Supreme Court decision from 2013, where Justice John Roberts, who seems to now be the hero of the moderate wing of the country in some ways, and even some Democrats, he wrote the majority opinion, basically, how do I put this? Not eradicating or eviscerating, but certainly gutting very key portions of the Voting Rights Act, Sections 4 and Section 5. So I'm going to ask Tom to talk about what that actually did. And also recall that when he wrote the opinion, he said there is no discernible difference, really statistically discernible difference, between white turnout and black turnout. Right? In 2013 is when the decision comes down. So he says, show me the difference, and then you can show me harm. But I don't see the difference. So let's talk about that rationale and then the impact of that decision.
Well, you're giving me PTSD, Professor, because 10 years ago, I was leading the Civil Rights Division, enforcing, among other things, the Voting Rights Act, and we were suing places like Texas and Florida and Mississippi and elsewhere. And that was undeniably the worst day of my tenure in the Obama administration. I think it's important to give you a little bit of background on what Section 5 did. For decades, and you're well aware of it, there were so many practices underway whose very overt, non-subtle goal was to disenfranchise black and brown voters, especially black voters, with poll taxes and, as John Lewis used to say, counting the number of jelly beans in a jar. There was nothing subtle about these barriers to voting. And what Section 5 did, which was really, really important, was it established a framework that reversed the presumption in so-called covered jurisdictions. These were jurisdictions that had a proven track record of doing nasty things to inhibit the right to vote. In those jurisdictions, every change that was made to voting, they had to do one of two things. They had to get a permission slip, basically, and they could do it one of two ways. They could go to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and seek what's called administrative preclearance, or they could go to court, a 3-judge panel in the District of Columbia, and seek preclearance. But the onus was on them to demonstrate that their change was non-discriminatory. And putting that onus on them was really important, because if Section 5 hadn't been there, Section 4 is the coverage formula, and Section 5, they work in tandem. And the reason that's so important is because if it wasn't there, then you are playing a game of whack-a-mole. Nefarious people were very creative in their nefariousness. And if every time they did something bad, we had to go to court and play that game of whack-a-mole, it was out of hand. And so Congress in 1965 passed the Voting Rights Act with this extraordinary provision. And the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized a number of times after substantial hearings, and most recently in 2006. And I don't know if anyone knows what the vote was in the U.S. Senate on the reauthorization in 2006. How many Republicans voted against it? The answer is 0. It was 98-0. The vote in the House was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. I think there were 30 or 35 members of Congress who voted against it. And by the way, Republicans were leading the House and the Senate during these reauthorization hearings. There was bipartisan understanding that Section 5, Section 4, this framework was still necessary. And the record proves it. I mean, I'm looking at data. More than 800 submissions between the 2006 reauthorization and the reauthorization that preceded it. Over 800 submissions were either altered or withdrawn. And I'll tell you, having enforced Section 5, it was really, really necessary. And sometimes you'd say, like, every change had to be approved? Yeah. Well, we had a case in Texas where they moved a voting location from a school where it had been forever to this meeting house that had been a notorious meeting house of the Klan. Now, that was, and that shouldn't happen. And, if we didn't have Section 5, you got to find someone to file a lawsuit, and it's just unworkable. So that's a tutorial in this. And basically the opinion of the Chief Justice said, we're in a new day and a new era, and the current burdens must be justified by the current needs. And, effectively saying discrimination is largely a thing of the past. And boy, oh boy, that's certainly not the case. And so without with the neutering of Section 5, which is what this decision did, it was then open season. And I'll give you one example of a real case that ended up making its way to the Supreme Court. I was the head of the Civil Rights Division, and Arizona attempted to pass a law to address, the term they used was ballot harvesting. That was their sort of pejorative term. And what that meant was they made it a crime for a person to carry the ballot of another person to the mailbox. Why was that? What was going on? Well, in order to understand Arizona, you got to understand the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is bigger than the state of West Virginia. There are people who live on the Navajo Nation in abject poverty. There are people who have to drive 2 hours to get to a mailbox. 2 hours to get to a mailbox. This law would have made it a crime to carry that person's ballot to the mailbox. And when I was head of the Civil Rights Division, we asked them a lot of questions about that law. And guess what they did? They withdrew the law because of the Section 5 framework. What did they do after Section 5 was neutered? They passed the law. This is an example of what you lose when you lose Section 5. And that's why this is so important. That was the heart and soul of the Voting Rights Act, in my judgment, and we have lost that.
Okay.
Sorry to take so long.
No, I think
really
on
important.
that note, we've discussed all these questions, but I'm ad-lib a little bit and switch the order.
Yeah.
Because you can make an argument that Joe Biden won in 2020 for lots of reasons, but one of the key elements of his support was the African-American vote, starting in the South Carolina primary, as we know, and then continuing throughout the primary season and the general election. In some states, turnout was as high as previous years, but in some states, black turnout was a little bit lower. But then, for example, in the Georgia special election, African-American turnout in January for that special election was higher than it was in the November presidential election by a few percentage points. The point is that President Biden has clearly indicated that he recognizes that core support from the African-American community. But now we're in a situation where states are trying to pass laws or have passed laws that will make it harder, frankly, for African Americans, particularly in rural areas, but even in areas that are that have not great mass transportation, for example, which covers a fair amount of the Southeast, that to move a polling place, to not allow 2 Sundays of early voting, but only 1 Sunday of early voting, or no Sundays of voting, because we know, churches are big transporters of voters on Sundays. So these are all things that disproportionately affect the African American community, yet the Biden administration looks as if it's powerless to stop it. So my question to you is, people talk about the Senate, they talk about Joe Manchin, but what should the administration have done? Should they have done things sooner? Should they have been willing to sacrifice the legislative filibuster for this effort? And if they can't do that, or they couldn't do that, what should the current Attorney General, Merrick Garland, be doing? And what can individuals who care about this issue do in the face of these real rollbacks?
Right. I mean, I would respectfully expand the aperture of your critique because, it is African American voters, but it's also Latino, Native American voters. The law in Arizona I just described was really targeted at Latino and Native American voters. And I wouldn't say we're powerless, but we have lost a critical tool. We can file constitutional claims. We can file Section 2 claims, and that's exactly what the Justice Department is doing now. But we need more tools. I absolutely would have eliminated the filibuster. This has been an absolute chronic abuse of the filibuster, and I would have done it right away. And the failure to do that right now, and I understand the answer. I mean, we don't have 50 votes to move the filibuster right now. These Senate elections that are coming up are critically important because if we want to do filibuster reform, we need 52 seats in the United States Senate. We have 50 right now. And I would absolutely change the rules because what's happening right now to voting rights, this water, if I handed it to you in line in Georgia, I would be committing a crime punishable by a year in jail. That law never would have seen the light of day in the Section 5 regime. It would have been laughed out. They wouldn't have passed it because they couldn't have gotten it through a court. Period. Hard stop. And so that is what's at stake here. And part of your question was, what can people do? Get out there and vote. I'm heartened by what I saw not only in 2020, but in 2019, in 2018. I look at Kentucky in 2019. We had, there's off-year elections for governor in Louisiana and Kentucky. In the 2015 election in Kentucky, 975,000 roughly people voted. In the 2019 election in Kentucky, it was like 1.4 million people voted, and Andy Beshear won that race by a smidgen. He won by like 5,000 or 6,000 votes. So, it was really close. But I'm heartened by this. And what we have to be doing is fighting these battles in the court of law. And by the way, Justice Roberts, or Chief Justice Roberts, is increasingly irrelevant because there are 6 of them now. It's no longer the Roberts Court. It's becoming increasingly the Thomas Court. And that's the reality of the moment right now. You look at some of these most recent opinions. Chief Justice Roberts is in the minority. And the rollback of voting rights is really troubling, which is why it's so important for Congress to get back there and pass the reforms that we need to see happen. But people also need to get out there and organize. They're going to continue these assaults. And, we had a very active campaign at the DNC, Professor, of what we call ballot curing, because they enacted all of these barriers. In Pennsylvania, you had to put the envelope in this, then you had to sign the outer envelope, and then you had to do this, and then the ankle bone had to be connected to the knee bone, and the knee bone to the thigh bone.
Well, Rhode Island voters know this because when we had to do our ballots, that's what you have to do. You have to sign it in a certain way, then you have to put it in an envelope, you have to sign the back of the envelope, and then you have to put another envelope. So we have similar practices.
So we have to fight multiple battles on multiple fronts. These battles in courts of law, these battles in state government, the battle in the federal government, and then making sure, and we were very, very active. If you look at the 2020 election, because of the hard work that was done across the country, rejection rates, for instance, in places like Florida, which were historically pretty high, were actually remarkably low. Georgia, the same thing, because of the attention to ballot curing. We had volunteers going every day. Okay, there were X number of votes that were rejected, so we were running a program. Hey, your vote got rejected, literally chasing. That's what we call it, ballot chasing. And so these sorts of things have to be done. They shouldn't have to be done. We should be making it easier for eligible people to vote, not harder. But this is the world we currently live in. And so if you are frustrated, as I am, there are remedies. And the remedy is get involved.
Now, on that note, I'd like to probe the depth, because we have such a unique opportunity with your legal experience in the administration, to think about how court cases would progress. So it was like, let's sue. Well, what are we suing on? I mean, where's the basis for the injury? And I think that's the first question is, do we have to wait for people to be denied the right to vote or have their ballot not counted in order to claim injury in the federal courts? And second, given that Article 1 of Section 4 of the Constitution says that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, it's federal elections, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at time make a law to alter such regulations. So when you think about that, I've always wondered, do you get an injunction? And if you get an injunction from a federal judge, does it have to be, for example, in Georgia, in a federal district court or appeals court circuit? How does that actually work when we say, let's go to court about these newly adopted restrictive laws?
Well, there's a number of ways to answer that. And let me give you some, what I believe are like good news examples. These are in more the redistricting context. But one of the things we worked really hard on at when I was at the DNC was paying attention to state Supreme Courts where people were elected there. So in 2017, in Ohio, there were 7 justices, and they were all Republican appointees. We worked hard, and we got it to 4-3 Republican. We were very involved in these races. And the chief judge there, historically, had this particular person, that is, has been very, very receptive to, very bound and determined to put a kibosh on gerrymandering as unlawful. And so we had 3 folks who were elected, and then you had this incumbent. And if you look at what's happened in Ohio, there have been lawsuits because the Republicans passed, or the voters passed an initiative to have commissions to try and take some of this politics out of it, but the Republicans ignored it. These cases went to state court, and the 3 Democratic judges and the 1 Republican judge has struck down the federal and the state maps repeatedly, and they keep going back just with basically the same map. And 4-3, they keep telling them, go back to the drawing board, go back to the drawing board. North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Yeah. So there are some remedies, and these are state by state kinds of remedies, but they're really important. And the Pennsylvania success back in 2017, I believe, enabled us to take a state that was 13-5 because the maps were so unfair. And now Pennsylvania is basically a 50-50 state in the House, which is basically where it should be because it's it's kind of a 50-50 state. Mm-hmm. So I would pay attention to those. Standing laws, once a law is passed, you don't have to wait for the election to take place to challenge the law. And the Justice Department under Attorney General Garland has been very aggressive about filing constitutional claims and claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act against Georgia, Texas, and elsewhere. Again, without the other tools of Section 5, we have one hand tied behind our back. But there's a lot that can be done and is being done. But again, it's after the fact stuff. They pass the law, and then we have to go to court, as opposed to the Section 5 framework where they got to get a permission slip before the law goes into effect. That's what we need. This is a new era, and if there's one thing that Chief Justice Roberts said in 2013 that has been totally proven wrong by the ensuing 9 years. He said, hey, it's a new day. It's an equally dark day here. If you think it's a thing of the past, voting shenanigans, my goodness, Mr. Chief Justice, please look at the last 9 years.
Well, on that note, just to follow up, have you been surprised that this Supreme Court has let both the North Carolina and I believe in the Pennsylvania cases, those state court decisions stand?
Yeah,
They have not interfered with the state Supreme Court decisions on these.
I'm not surprised because this is federalism. The federal Constitution is a floor. It's not a ceiling. And that's why I bring up these state court cases. They are really, really important. And that's where a lot of activity is going to be. Now, there are limits to that. The Texas court, the state of Texas highest court, not exactly a place you're going to go to for relief. And so there are, again, limits. But I always like to bring some kernels of hope to this because it's easy to get very, down and depressed looking around.
So if you are somebody who is a student at Brown and is going home for the summer, is not staying in the state of Rhode Island, and wants to be active in voter registration, what would you suggest in terms of either party organization or Board of Elections? How can they actually make sure that people are registered? And what are the mechanisms for people to be able to do these sorts of things?
Yeah, well, different states have different rules. And, I just got in the mail a month ago application for a vote by mail. Our primary is July the 19th. If you're picking a date to hold an election and your goal is to maximize turnout, picking a date in the heart of the summer, wouldn't exactly be on that short list of this is the best date. But you know what? It is what it is. There's some litigation pending in Maryland regarding redistricting, and so totally get it. And
they moved it, right?
They moved it from June 28th to July the 19th, and they have to get through this litigation. The simple point, though, is the rules apply to everyone. And the way I look at it, more time to talk to voters. And again, it's really important for people who want to get involved here. Help register, folks. Get involved in these ballot cure efforts. I'm really proud of the work that we were able to do in some of these critical battleground states to cure ballots. It's unfortunate that that's the world we have to be in. But what happens is it's kind of it's an interesting process because our efforts begin with getting people registered, getting people. There's a gold standard thing in Arizona called PEVL, the Permanent Early Voting List. Mm-hmm. Get on that permanent early voting list. Much easier to vote. Then you put it in the mail, and then these volunteers or other folks are tracking this so that you know who voted, and it enables you to be efficient. I don't want to call you if you voted 2 weeks ago. That's an inefficient use of volunteer resources. So those who are concerned about our democracy, get involved. And again, another good news story is 2018, that midterm election, we saw a record turnout as well. Or at least it was the highest turnout since the 60s for a midterm election. Our democracy is on fire. It's a five-alarm blaze. There's a global democracy recession underway right now. And you can be a spectator or you can roll up your sleeves and get involved. And I hope students here continue to get involved. I'm really heartened that right outside the door here, they're registering voters. That's what should be done day in and day out. So I applaud the Brown students doing that.
So I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of voting. I know when I was in college, I did the same thing in the city of Chicago, and that was an interesting process to navigate in the 1980s. But you could be certified by the Board of Elections to be a registrar. So I could become from my home state, and I could move to Chicago and re-register to vote, but also become a registrar and then register people on the spot when I knocked on doors to try to get them registered or get them off the rolls. But what's a broader thing that's interesting, there's two things that you raised I think are important to cover. One is, familiarity with process is one of the key ways in which you guarantee people will vote repeatedly. That they know where their polling place is if they want to vote in person, or they know the procedure for a mail-in ballot. What Arizona's done is make it very easy for a very long time to mail in your ballot. Why? They've had a lot of what we used to call snowbirds. They have a lot of people who will register, spend 6 months and a day in Arizona and maybe live in a high-tax state in the Northeast, but then they'll have a property in Arizona. They'll register to vote in Arizona, but they won't be there in November, let's say, for the election. So it's been they're a very strong voice, and they've been equally, if not more, Republican than Democrat. So they've always pressured Arizona legislature to allow them to do that. Florida is the same. Florida, actually, no matter what you're hearing about Florida, their voter suppression and restrictions are really aimed at people who vote in person, not the people who mail in the ballots, because they have such a large number of people who have 2 homes or a second home in Florida, but count it because they have no state income tax as their permanent residence. So you're not seeing an assault on mail-in ballots randomly. You're seeing an assault on absentee ballots from communities that traditionally vote Democratic, from people who live there. Or they're disabled, or they might be away, or they don't have transportation to the polling place. That's the kind of people that are being targeted. So that's the differential there. And the second thing is, there's a really good article by Henry Brady and a co-author that actually did a sample in a study in California, which looks at when you move somebody's polling place, what happens to turnout. From election to election, whether it's a presidential election to a midterm and then back again, what happens to turnout? You know what happens? It drops. And it drops across the board for ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Everywhere you look, it drops. Why? Because people are creatures of habit. Even in Providence, if anybody notices, they've been moving around the polling places in the last 6 to 10 years, and you think, I can't find my polling place. You'll show up to vote because that's where you used to vote, and they tell you, no, it's across the street or it's down the block. Now, there's drop-off when that happens. People are busy. They're going to work. They're not going to vote. They're just going to say, well, I can't vote. I can't get over there. There might be a line. So these are really, they look innocent, but they have real effects on voting, and they tend to disproportionately affect the people who have less time, less mobility, less even access to public transportation. So we see this happening in a lot of places under the auspices of economy. We don't need to provide a polling place in that rural area where 30 people vote because it's not, cost effective to open up the polling places. But that's just a way of suppressing the vote. So there's real evidence about this, how it really matters a great deal.
Arizona embarrassed the heck out of itself. The first election after Section 5 was neutered, they shrunk the number of polling places in minority communities. They had a debacle of an election. It was such a debacle that even the Republicans were embarrassed, and they got sued successfully. And this is what keeps happening. And we've just got to maintain our vigilance. I don't know if you've been watching Maricopa County. Maricopa County, 62% of the vote in an Arizona election, a statewide election, comes from one county, Maricopa County. What is the response to Joe Biden winning Arizona? There is a proposal literally running its way through the Arizona legislature right now to divide up Maricopa County into 4 jurisdictions. And the purpose of that was the Maricopa County elections officials refused to do all this stuff that the, folks who said the election was stolen. And so if they divide it up into 4 jurisdictions, break up the county. And you know what the implications of breaking up a county are for services and schools and all sorts of policing and security? I mean, all toward the end of, I want to have a person in charge that I can tell, I want you to certify the election for the person I want you to certify the election for. I've seen a lot of nasty things going on. That one kind of takes the cake.
So this is why it's also really important to pay attention to state elections and state redistricting, which is something that the Republicans have done a very good job of over the last 10 to 15 years. They pay a lot of attention to it. They use things like we saw in Virginia, critical race theory or other hot-button salient issues that can be distorted, and they use them to great effect. In the in 2000s, in the aughts, it used to be gay marriage, for example. They would use that not only for presidential elections, but for state elections, too, to put it on the ballot. And they would try to get a very hot-button referendum out to get their people out, particularly in midterm elections that were frequently state legislative elections. So this is the cycle. Republicans tend to vote in bigger numbers, or bigger percentage of self-identified Republicans vote in midterm elections compared to Democrats, except for 2018. So it can shift, but the Democrats have been at a disadvantage in this. And so the Republicans are taking advantage of their time right now in controlling more state legislatures and governorships to actually roll back opportunities for people to vote in the midterms, because they recognize how important that state legislative control is. So on that note, and I want to open it up for questions soon. So we talked about what order to ask this question in, but would it be different if there were a constitutional right to vote? So the 15th and 19th Amendments state that the right to vote shall not be abridged based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude or sex. But it's not quite the same thing as saying every U.S. citizen or every resident of the United States of America, I mean, you can broaden your imagination, has a right to vote freely. But it's not in the Constitution. And do you think that's just semantic, or do you think that has substantive effect when you're going to court and suing about these kinds of laws?
Well, I would like to think we understand why the 15th Amendment was passed. There was this thing called the Civil War. And I would like to think that should be enough to make clear that these efforts to make it harder for communities of color to vote would be clearly violative of what you've just read. But we are in a moment in time right now where we have a court we just had another decision on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that chipped away. There's still remedies under Section 2, but it chipped away. I think the thing that if I had the opportunity to be king for a day, the decentralized nature of our voting system, if you look at other mature democracies around the world, that's not how you do it. And we all remember, or some of us a little longer in the tooth remember, I thought Chad was the name of like my neighbor, and then I heard about hanging Chad in the 2000 election. And when you have all this decentralization of voting, there are a combination of two different forces. One is just chronic incompetence, and then the other is nefarious activity. And when you have this level of decentralization, you increase the likelihood of shenanigans, and I think that's really problematic. But this is the system that we have had, and I invite people to look around the world at mature democracies. I'm not sure that there are many, if any, mature democracies that would recommend this sort of system of voting moving forward. And I can just cite you example after example after example of, again, often just well-intentioned, but pure incompetence. If incompetence is incompetence, and and that's because in many jurisdictions, because of our decentralized structure, you have all these volunteers coming in, and God bless them for doing it. But it's like the most sacred right, and we're putting stuff out. Please come, please help, please help. We don't do that. That's a recipe for disaster. And so in terms of that question, I find myself reflecting more on the administration of elections and the consequences that flow from our exceedingly decentralized structure.
Okay, so I'm going to not hog the floor anymore. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. We do have a microphone, so if somebody has a question, we'd love to hear it. Or wants to make a case about some other country's voting system.
I have two short questions. One is about a holiday for voting, and the other is about voting by phone or by computer. What are the prospects of those?
I I would certainly support making the federal election day a holiday. It's not a panacea, and actually, I think what we want to do is an all of the above strategy. We want to make it easier for people to vote early, vote by mail, and then make sure that those votes are counted, because a big part of the litigation in 2020 was, when does it have to be received by? If we're going to put ourselves at the mercy of the United States postal system under Louis DeJoy, we are putting our voting rights at risk. And so gold standard states like California have a postmarked by Election Day and then receipt by a reasonable amount of time after Election Day. I forgot what it is in California. I think it may be 7 days or may even be 10 days. Does it delay the receipt, the processing of final results? Yeah, but this is democracy. Like, this is really, really important. And so, having an election holiday, I think would also help get folks out. But I don't want people to just vote on one day. Like, Tuesday is kind of an odd day. If you're doing shift work, that's a real challenge. So I certainly support doing that. But I also think that the key to success this past November 2020, was the fact that people had options. And what was unfortunate is there were undeniable instances of people who voted, got it, sent it in 5 days in advance, and because of the vagaries of the mail, it didn't arrive the day of the election, and they were disenfranchised. You had the second half of your question, and I forgot.
It was up.
Oh, yes. We studied that at the Justice Department, and I have real concerns about the cybersecurity of that. And I'm not yet persuaded that we can do it in a manner that would withstand cyber attack. I think we need to continue to study that and figure out whether that is a possibility to do. But I am, at the moment, not persuaded that we can carry it off in a manner that will ensure the integrity of the election.
Yeah, just to add 2 points to that. One is, I always thought about Election Day, and Brown in 2020 gave staff and employees the day to vote. So we were in business at Brown, we had classes, but you could take the day, and a paid day for Election Day, which I think is a trend that other employers may start to adopt. But the issue is that when you think about it, Veterans Day comes pretty close in most years to Election Day. And so if you give Tuesday off and then the following Monday is off, or that Thursday, whenever Veterans Day falls, people might go away. In fact, people might go on vacation, and then if they go on vacation, then they need to absentee ballot. So what's interesting is that you may be trying to increase in-person balloting, but in some communities, you may find yourself actually with a larger percentage of absentee ballots, which could then be disenfranchised. The second thing is, I think early voting, 7 to 10 days. Ohio, for example, they cut it from 2 weeks, but they kept it at 10 days. Mike DeWine is the Republican governor of Ohio, and they sort of compromised. They eliminated the second Sunday because African-American churches get the Democrats out on those days, but they kept 10 days. And you can have an argument about whether 10 days seems like a reasonable amount of time for people to cast their votes. But there's also something about the act of voting, the act of visibly voting, and having other people standing either in line or seeing you at the polling place that are different from you in whatever way you want to think about differences, whether it's age or it's race or it's ethnicity or gender or non-gender conforming, non-gender identifying. You get a sense of who's voting, who's your community, who is trying to be represented. And I think that is very important in this day and age, particularly social media and reliance on our phones for everything. And I'm always telling students at Brown, look up, because they're frequently in their phones. So I think that's very important for the future of democracy. As the American population gets more and more diverse, with lots of different lived experiences, seeing people who are members of your community who may or may not look like you, or may not be your age, or whatever, or maybe not vote the same way you do, is crucially important to legitimacy, to saying every voice matters, everybody has a right to vote, and people vote. that it's not just people like me that vote and therefore should control the direction of legislation. It's everybody voting. And so I think there's merit to in-person voting. And at the same time, I agree that there's no way it should just be on one day.
There's merit. The really fundamental thing is choice, multiple choices. We had record turnout because we had multiple choices. And I know people who will always vote in person, and I totally respect that. I used to bring my kids with me, and I enjoyed getting them in the habit. You mentioned Ohio, and I had a major beef with Ohio, so I need to get it off my chest. And this is another example of a law that was passed to make it harder for folks to vote. They passed a bill that limited the number of early voting sites per county to 1. It's ridiculous. Ohio has something like 100 counties. I was in Ohio the weekend before the election in 2016, the Clinton-Trump election. And in the county that where Cincinnati lies, the lines were like 2 hours long. And why? Because, that county has literally 20 times more people than some of these rural counties. Why do you make people, and they knew that. And by the way, where do you have more Democratic voters? In Cuyahoga County, in Franklin County, which is Columbus, and in the Cincinnati area. I mean, no mystery to why they were doing that. And there was litigation, fighting over that. Let's have a debate about the vision of America, but then let's understand what the lesson of 2020 was. Let's make it easier, not harder, for people to vote. You shouldn't be scared. One of the myths of voting in the world of Donald Trump, in the party of Trump, is that high turnout unequivocally helps Democrats. High turnout does not unequivocally help Democrats. Look at the 2020 election.
And
Exhibit A.
And 2016. Both
it
elections.
is, the 2021 election in Virginia. Terry McAuliffe got something like 600,000 more votes. He got hundreds of thousands of more votes than Ralph Northam got. He got hundreds of thousands of more votes than he got when he won in 2013. And he lost. So, I got to make it harder to vote because I'm scared. Actually, they really shouldn't be scared. They did okay in 2020. We didn't do so hot in the U.S. House races in 2020 because Donald Trump was a turnout machine for a certain subset of voters. Those are the facts.
And what's interesting to me is also that state legislators, state legislators are elected. They're incumbents. So why would you trust incumbents to make decisions about allowing you to vote, where you can vote, what time you can vote, when you can vote, how you can vote? They're incumbents. They have a very strong, both Democrats and Republicans have a strong desire to get reelected, and they like to eliminate uncertainty. And so the battle now is that, you don't want, and what Republicans have figured out, and they've always wanted to sort of really figure out who's going to vote. They had reliably drawn districts. They knew who was going to turn out. But Donald Trump flipped the script on them because he brought in a lot of people, just as Barack Obama did in 2008. A lot of people had not voted before. And you don't always know how they'll vote and will they stay loyal. But the Republicans figured this segment of the population came out and voted for Trump, and they actually benefited from that. So you'll notice that increasingly these restrictions are geared towards urban areas and not rural areas, because the Republicans in these states that are controlled by Republicans recognize that the vote that never really happened in rural areas is still is happening in big numbers, and you can win a state election if you get a really high turnout in a lot of rural counties. Those votes add up. So that's the puzzle for me. People have always been willing to believe incumbent officials who have a stake in structuring how you can vote, that they know better about how to vote and that they should be able to limit how you can vote. Doesn't make any sense to me given that they are running the show. So that's why the states that have redistricting commissions, for example, I think there are almost 14 of them that have redistricting commissions, those lend a little bit more legitimacy to the process because they have neutral people who are drawing the districts. Yeah. We're going to wait for the mic.
Yeah, for many years, I've heard the current demographic changes favored Democratic Party. And so what happened? Why so worried?
Well, I think another, I don't know if myth is the right word. The notion that demography is destiny, I think, is an ill-advised strategy. Demography is only destiny if you are talking to communities about the issues that they care about. Now, I've heard there's been a lot of discussion about various subcategories of voters and what happened to the Latino vote, for instance. It was terrible. And the answer is you got to go jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The Latino vote is why Joe Biden won Arizona. Substantial increase in turnout. And that was the reason that he won. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, number of other states. Massive underperformance, on the other hand, in South Florida and South Texas. Harris County, the big population centers in Texas, Latino voters were overwhelmingly Democratic. But part of the challenge in say South Texas is that we weren't talking to them, and we weren't speaking to a lot of the issues of concern. So, demography, the notion that we just have to let demography unfold and we're going to magically win, we're still commanding a solid majority of African American, Latino, and API communities. But I certainly don't take that for granted. And Donald Trump made some progress, still lost by a lot. But when you're cobbling together a coalition and elections are won at margins, if you can get just a few points here and a few points there, I mean, that was our strategy in rural America. We organized there. Democrats all too frequently had abandoned rural America. We organized there, not because I thought we were going to win 50% of rural voters in Pennsylvania, but number one, it's a morally bankrupt strategy not to show up. And number two, we ended up losing by less. And when you lose by less in certain parts of the state, that's how you win the state in the aggregate. And so I think another myth that we need to come to grips with is this notion that demography will turn everything around. Demography will turn everything around if you speak to issues that matter to people.
So the real problem is voter turnout, right? So what percentage of African Americans voted?
Well, we saw very significant increases in voter turnout, and Professor Schiller correctly pointed out that South Carolina was the turning point for Joe Biden, and black voters, who are, especially black women, who are the backbone of the Democratic Party, showed up in force for Joe Biden. I mean, I've never seen an arc of a primary, turn on a dime. That was 3 days. I was in South Carolina the day of the primary there, and then I went to North Carolina for an event the next day. And I mean, this race was effectively turned around and over in a 72-hour period. And Senator Senator Klobuchar and Mayor Pete, I mean, they got out of the race before Super Tuesday because they saw the same data everyone else was seeing, which is this train is getting some mow, and so again, we saw the increases in turnout, and we actually saw some increases in Gen Z turnout. Especially if you look at the data. I was looking at data recently in Arizona, significant increases in Gen Z turnout. But there's no cause for doing cartwheels when turnout increased 50% among young people in the 2018 cycle, which meant that now 1 in 3 young people voted. Like, I'm excited that it went up as much as it did, but anyone who wants to do cartwheels when 2 out of 3 are still staying home, that's not exactly cause for a ticker tape.
So this executive problem, right? You can turn the myth into reality. if people come out to vote.
If people, right, so into reality, if people come out to vote, is that what you're saying? So African American turnout varied across states, but it basically hovered between 57% and 64% in 2020. Its peak was 67% in 2012. So it paralleled white turnout and exceeded white turnout in 2012. So I think one of the things we think about when we think about voting is also some of the changes that have been put in place almost 10 years ago at least, where places like North Carolina were preventing students from voting. If you hadn't lived in the state, for example, for 6 months or something, or a year, and it used to be you had to be there 30 days. So if you came as a fresh person and you were 18 in September, you could register to vote in North Carolina and vote in November, but they got rid of that. So a lot of Republican legislators recognize that some of these large universities, state schools with students from out of state would affect their elections, so they made it harder. So there are barriers, I think, that are somewhat unique, at least to college age. And I think, but only less than 40% of all people in the age of 18 to 30 go to college. So we got 60% of people in that age group that don't leave their areas. And I wonder if some of the Supreme Court decisions that are coming down this year, most likely the reversion of abortion rights, eliminating the constitutional protection for abortion or rolling it out to 6 weeks or something. I think if that doesn't catalyze young people, I think you have to think about what could, because it's the first time in 50 years that right will be actually gone at the federal level, or so rolled back that it essentially doesn't exist. And that is the first time that people between the ages of 18 and 35 would have ever lived in that kind of environment. So I think those sorts of issues, and you can see this even in the nomination of the Supreme Court justice. Now, the Republicans are attacking her in ways that you might have found surprising 20 years ago in terms of how directly they're attacking her, an African-American woman, the first African-American woman nominated to the court. But they're not going to go so far. The Democrats are going to confirm her. And if they thought there was a chance they wouldn't, they would not want to be blamed for the withdrawal of the nomination. But increasingly, you're seeing the Republicans test the theory that if you aren't supportive of a liberal black justice or a liberal black candidate, you'll lose the black vote. And the same thing for Latina and Latinx. If you're not supportive of Democratic Latinos or Latinos in general, you'll lose the Latino vote. They're pushing that. They're testing that now, the Republicans. And they made some gains, but if you look at the gains they made, they're really specific, I think, to nation of origin among naturalized or U.S. citizens that were from Venezuela and Brazil and in Miami, for example, and also small businesses who were really struggling in the pandemic and struggling with taxes and are, don't feel and are more conservative on social issues in some Latino communities. So there's some good work in political science being done on those kinds of issues, but voting is multidimensional. Identity is multidimensional. And that's the thing the Republicans are pushing to see what will trigger inflation, for example, gas prices. Will that overcome any other kinds of concerns that people have, maybe based on their identity?
You mentioned Latino voters. One of the things we did when I was at the DNC, and it's relevant to what you just said, was when I first got there, if you were talking to a person named Perez in Florida and you wanted that person to vote for the Democrat, the voter file only contained, it contained name, address, and voter history. If you're talking to a person named Perez in Florida and you want that person to vote for a Democrat, or let me back up. You want to have a engagement strategy for that person. You're missing a critical data point, which is, are they Perez de Cuba, Perez de Puerto Rico, Perez de Dominican Republic? Where are they from? Ethnicity modeling is indispensable to understanding Florida politics. Now, ethnicity modeling is a lot easier in Arizona, where the overwhelming percentage of Latinos are from Mexico. But knowing the information is indispensable to running an effective strategy. You're going to have a totally different conversation with the Cuban American Perez than you are with the Puerto Rican Perez. And we didn't have that data in the voter file, and it just made life a lot more challenging. And one other little in the category of things that anger me to no end. In Texas, their voter ID laws, your concealed carry permit is a permissible form of ID, but your college ID is not. Just nothing subtle about what they're trying to do there. They don't want y'all, especially if you're a outlier from some other state.
Right.
They don't want you coming into their state and voting.
Right. So we have time for one last question. Does anybody have anyone? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. I'm maybe naive, and I think that just basically this is a representative democracy, and I think that when you're talking about demographics as well as the partisanship and the different ways in which the parties go to attract votes and wins in local and national and state legislation, just voting and having those things, why do you think it is that the Republicans are kind of neglecting to broaden the scope of their coalition, whereas it seems like they are going more conservative, whereas the Democrats are staying a little bit more moderate when there's calls for more progressivism, especially when you're talking about attracting more diverse voters and where you have a trend of increasing minority-majority states. I mean, you talked about it being morally corrupt to kind of cut people out, but also, isn't it just lazy?
No, I mean, it's a very unique strategy that Donald Trump has undertaken. The party of Lincoln is dead and buried. The party of Trump is, kind of a party of subtraction. It's not trying to extend its reach in appreciable ways. And that's why I think they're going to have some real challenges and continue to have real challenges. But they are also touching a raw nerve. And I think it gets back to a basic proposition that's always been in America, which is our generation's going to be better off than our parents' generation, and our kids' generation's going to be better off than ours. That basic bargain of America has been called into question. And Donald Trump, masterfully played a blame game that has been played by many of his predecessors. It's not your fault. It was the immigrants' fault. And that sort of, politics of division, in 2016 especially, proved very, very effective. But again, another myth that I would observe in 2022 here is I don't think it's an accurate statement to think that, Donald Trump has driven independent voters into the Democratic Party's hands. If that were the case, the data in the 2021 election in Virginia and to some extent New Jersey belies that. These folks are still up for grabs, and we've got to lead with our values. We've got to make sure we tell people what we stand for. It is no longer sufficient in a closing argument to say, vote for me, the other guy's Trump. Even if it's provable in a court of law, that's not enough. People want to know what you stand for, what you're going to fight for. That's the politics of addition. These cynical politics of division are, really, they're odious. And when you combine them with dark money and gerrymandering, it really has brought our democracy to its knees. And I think there are 35 seats, and I could be off by a few, but I'm not off by much, 35 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives that will be competitive in this decade. And if you look at that figure, say, 2 decades ago and a decade ago, 2 decades ago especially, there were probably 130 seats, 140 seats that were competitive. And what does that mean? What is the implication of that? for the overwhelming majority of members of Congress, Republican or Democrat, when they're making a vote, if your goal is to get reelected, their number one concern is going to be a challenge to their right if they're a Republican and a challenge to their left if they're a Democrat. If you think that the Marjorie Taylor Greens are a temporary aberration, I think it's incredibly likely that come next year, they now have two like major league knuckle draggers in the woman from Colorado,
Lauren
Boebert.
Boebert, yeah.
I'm going to guess that they're going to have 4 or 5 because of what's happening and how lines are being drawn. So they're going to have company. And that's a really poor reflection on our democracy. But that's what dark money and gerrymandering. There was a Supreme Court case on gerrymandering a couple of years ago. One of the states was Maryland, and the other state was Wisconsin. I was hoping that we would lose that case, and that the court would draw some lines. And I think it is possible for the court to have drawn some lines. They punted. They refused to do it. And the one thing I will say is I will not unilaterally disarm because I don't go to knife fights with spoons. And that is why we are in the challenging situation that we are in. And when you only have 35 seats or so that are going to be competitive for the next decade, if you think what's going on in the House is going to get appreciably different, I'm not seeing it.
Well, I want to end on that note, but I want to put in a little disclaimer, which is that if there's nothing else that we have, I think, come to understand since 2015, or even since, for those of us old enough, 2008, the Democratic primary nomination with the emergence of Barack Obama, that politics changes more rapidly than ever before. And that conditions, external shock conditions, obviously the tragedy that's undergoing in Ukraine, they really move fast. People's attention spans are even shorter than they've ever been. And so the conditions under which people will start casting their votes in October and November could be actually quite different than they are today. And what you see is the strategic behavior of candidates to retire, House Democrats in particular, and people to run. That's being determined now with primaries, now until August, by the way, which is when Arizona holds its primary in the very hottest month of the year there. So I would encourage everybody to pay attention to the way in which things are moving and how fast they're moving, and not to believe that if the election were held today and the election is held in November, there's going to be the exact same outcome, because I don't believe that. I think that a lot of things can change. So, so what we're hoping to do at Taubman and Watson is to have informational sessions and dialogues even throughout the summer in this very important midterm year on a lot of these subjects, and take us into fall when it will get busier. But really to keep track of how different conditions, the combination of different conditions are affecting public opinion, and see what kind of trends persist and what kind of trends dissipate.
I'm very optimistic about continuing this turnout trend. I mean, you saw it in 2017, we saw it in 2018, saw it in 2019, saw it in 2020, saw it last year. That's the remedy. If you're angry at the state of our democracy, what was it Obama used to say? Don't boo, vote.
Vote.
And get out there, and that's what it's all about. And get involved. I'm heartened by the Brown students who are over here. We're what March, so we're 7-8 months away. That's a lifetime in politics, especially in the world in which we currently live. And when I've been around the block a little bit on this. I mean, things can change in so many ways, shapes, and forms. And I just want folks to get out there. I really do think that our democracy demands this participation. What is the diminution of the right to vote is really unconscionable. And the most immediate remedy that we can undertake is get involved at every step of the process. People said we were going to have terrible turnout in 2020, and look what happened. And we didn't have a vaccine then. People were taking their lives into their own hands in some cases, and we ended up with that record turnout. Let's keep that streak alive. I am not afraid of record turnout. I recognize that record turnout could inure to our detriment or inure to our success. It was both in 2020. But I want to make sure at the end of the day that we do our level best. Sir, you're correct. We have more work to do. There's still too many people who are sitting home. And I don't know what else it's going to take. You correctly pointed out. I mean,
It'll take life-changing decisions by institutions,
Yeah.
particularly for people who are under the age of 35, to really get those numbers, which tend to be in the 30s for midterm elections and as high as only 48% in presidential elections, really high enough for Republicans and Democrats just to create a larger community of voters. And so we'll just have to wait and see and continue to press for it.
There was a focus group, I recall, after the 2016 election of women who voted for Trump, and they were the question was asked about, well, what about the potential assaults on a woman's right to choose? And this is anecdotal, but the answer was, oh, that's well settled. We don't have to worry about that. That's just fear mongering.
And
I'd like to see that focus group again.
Yeah, I do
because-
think that issue will be much more profound than, at least in the short term, before technology, I think, does a lot in terms of access. But I think that is an issue, like I said, for the first time in 50 years, where that right will be genuinely threatened for a population that has never really worried about it. So I think that's going to be a very interesting thing. That's one of the things that I'm thinking about will be changing the dynamics this summer in terms of the election. So we'll see.
We shall see.
But thank you so much for coming, and we hope that you will come to future events. So
Thank you.
take care.
Have a good day.